Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Mike Vermillion, the Director of the Global Water Security Center, or GWSC, here at the University of Alabama. We are delighted to host this conversation today with Peter Schwartzstein about his book, The Heat and the Fury, on the Front Lines of Climate Violence. GWSC is a research center here at the university where we translate water and environmental science to support national security decision-making, with a focus on security and stability implications of water, food, and energy challenges. We work closely with U.S. defense and intelligence stakeholders to ensure that sound science informs strategic decisions. Today, we are pleased to host Peter, an international journalist and researcher whose work examines how water scarcity, governance, and conflict intersects across the Middle East and North Africa. His reporting is grounded in extensive field experience, and he lives in the regions he studies. It is a privilege to have someone with that depth of expertise here on campus. The discussion will be moderated by Dr. Kate Brauman, GWSC's Deputy Director. Dr. Brauman is a globally recognized leader in water resources and ecosystem services, whose research and policy engagement span the United Nations, Congress, and major international scientific assessments. We're grateful for her leadership and for guiding today's discussion. Please join me in welcoming Peter Schwartzstein.
Peter, I am delighted that you are here with us today. I have a ton of questions for you, but I wanted to start out by acknowledging that maybe not everyone in the room has read your book yet. So do you have an elevator pitch? What is this book about?
Thank you, Kate, and thank you to all of you for coming out. I'm extremely delighted to have an opportunity to come to university, to come to the state in which my grandfather was born. So yeah, and I've absolutely no expectation that any or many of you will have read the book, but I very much hope that you come away from this chat inspired to acquire it and perhaps read it thereafter. So this book is the first attempt to explore and sort of fully lay out to the average person on the street quite how climate and environmental stresses are contributing to violence, large and small, across the world. Because while large parts of the defense and security sector in this country and in other parts of the world, as Mike pointed out, have been very aware of climate and environment's capacity to contribute to very serious national security threats for quite some time. This has nevertheless been a field that's been pretty contained in slightly niche, slightly wonky parts of the defense and scholarly world. So by trying to sort of lay it out in a very journalistic and hopefully very sort of comprehensible and compelling manner, I've sort of tried to sort of break open this sort of previously inaccessible field.
Well, so that's sort of one of my first questions is why climate? Is this not environmental degradation writ large? Climate feels like it might be a little political today, and how do we know that's what this is about?
So I mean, several parts to the question. I often think of climate as basically an amplifier of whatever a place's existing challenges and existing problems are. So if, for example, and I've got an array of photographs taken by a bunch of photographer colleagues as a means of sort of illustrating some of the points that I plan to make. I've got, anyway, I'm trying to background that. If, for example, a place is dealing with long-standing corruption, well, climate stresses will often make the impact of that corruption felt that bit more. But you're quite right to say that kind of this field, and indeed this book, is not purely about climate. When you have climate-related violence, it's almost always an ugly marriage of climate stresses and varying degrees of poor quality governance. And there's also, to kind of throw in the environment element, I mean, this book is as much about poor quality governance and about non-climate related environmental challenges as it is about climate change writ large. And there's a kind of an old Arab proverb, which is that even a mosquito can make a lion's eye bleed. If you have a natural landscape that has already been battered by groundwater depletion, by air pollution and water pollution, it doesn't necessarily take much in the way of a climate stress to be that kind of proverbial bridge too far. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Well, I mean, I think that segues nicely into something else that I wanted to ask you about, which is that you're a journalist and a social scientist, and yet you've written this amazing book about climate and the effects of climate, and I think that brings a really exciting perspective. But could you talk a little bit about your point of entry into the climate and security work?
Yeah, I mean, I sort of ended up in this field sort of by accident. I was a political correspondent for Reuters back in the day, and I found myself based in Egypt back in 2013, reporting on many of these sort of in-your-face political challenges and bouts of violence that accompanied the 2013 military coup there. But for a broad array of reasons, I sort of soon found myself kind of keen to find a sort of slightly different journalistic beat, and was sort of drawn to covering the problems that were roiling rural parts of Egypt and rural parts of many of its neighbours. And the more that I reported, the more that I came to see how intimately associated and intimately wrapped up the kind of political and security challenges that I'd been dwelling with were with the environmental and climate ones that I was all of a sudden focused on. Now, I mean, if you were sort of new to this sort of climate security discussion, but have heard a little bit about it, it's most likely in the context of Syria. So back in 2011, 2012, 2013, in the early years of the Syrian civil war, a war, of course, that, as many of you know, was sort of more or less settled in 2024 after 15 brutal years of conflict, there was a tremendous amount of discussion in those early years about the extent to which climate-induced drought might have played a part in triggering the kind of initial hostilities against the long-standing regime of Bashar al-Assad. And I've got a photo here, and I'll try and articulate a little bit what each of these images represents over the course of the call. Yeah, but as I found in the northeast of Syria, where I worked quite a lot between 2014 and 2022, climate was indeed a big contributor to those sort of initial protests that then sort of bled into the kind of decade and a bit of hostilities. But it did so in a much nittier, much more complicated manner than the kind of narrative of the day suggested. And this was a family that I met, a farming family in the Hasaka area. And in the years sort of leading up to the revolution, they had struggled with the kind of long-standing demands for bribes that sort of local officials had imposed upon them. Whenever they went to market, they had to pass through various checkpoints where the police demanded little bits of money to pass. Whenever they engaged with the agricultural ministry office, which was theoretically giving them either free or heavily discounted seeds and fertilizer, they had to pay little bribes. And that was obviously a long-standing source of anger and distress. But as drought became that bit more intense and that bit more regular, their income fell in a commensurate manner, and hence their capacity to actually pay these bribes just dropped and dropped and dropped. So it's not that the corruption got any worse, it's that on account of climate-induced drought, their capacity to deal with the corruption just became significantly more limited. So it's an extremely roundabout answer to your question, but ultimately, as I found, like everything to do with the sort of environment and climate kind of reporting beat in the region, very soon kind of just found me sort of wrapped up in many of the same violence and security issues that I'd been reporting beforehand.
Well, I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me. And we're here at the Global Water Security Center. You know, your book is called The Heat and the Fury, but obviously I'm interested in water. And one of the things that really struck me is how water was perhaps the biggest piece of pretty much everything you reported in the book, including in Syria, like you were just talking about. So I would love to dive into some of those other cases. And, you know, Iraq and ISIS feel like a very timely one to this day. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Certainly. I mean, first of all, as you very correctly identify, I mean, water is generally the messenger by which climate-related stresses come to your door, either too much water, too little water, water that just comes in an unpredictable or uncertain manner. And so without even meaning to, I ended up sort of writing a book about water. But as Kate said, a lot of my work has been wrapped up with ISIS, sort of extremely unpleasant, to put it lightly, jihadist group that caused all manner of death and destruction across Iraq and Syria. And between about 2014 and 2017, I spent many, many months in different parts of rural Iraq and rural Syria, trying to better understand how this jihadist group had harnessed collapsing agricultural conditions to bolster its ranks. Now, neither I nor any of my colleagues are suggesting that this sort of beast of a group was a climate or kind of collapsing agriculture related force alone. What we were suggesting was that it never would have recruited anywhere near as many fighters as it ultimately did without climate and environmental challenges wreaking the kind of havoc that they were in rural parts of the country. And what I found over the course of interviews in about 100 different villages in the center and the north and the east of the country was that the villages that had a supplementary source of irrigation, like deep bore wells or like access to an irrigation canals that kind of fed off the great rivers of the country, yielded on average 3 times, or sometimes up to 4 or 5 times, fewer fighters than the villages that depended on rain and rain alone. Because ultimately, as drought became that bit more pronounced, that bit more intense, that bit more regular, those villages that were dependent on those increasingly wayward rains became that bit poorer, that bit more desperate, and that bit more susceptible to the entreaties of these recruiters when they came along, dangling the kinds of salaries that they could otherwise only dream of. One of the takeaways that I hope readers of the book will get is that we are systematically sort of underestimating climate's contribution to violence because we don't really look at how climate is acting on other drivers of instability, like corruption, like inequality. And I want to give you an additional example here. I've got, I think, a photo to illustrate this point as well, if I can find it. Yeah. So during the battle to retake, this is an image from Mosul. I, along with the crowd there, was running because there was one of these little commercial drones that ISIS was deploying with kind of little munitions, and they'd just been dropping a bunch in the background. So this was an image that my photographer colleague snapped as we sort of ran at full pelt to sort of try and find some kind of safety. But the reason I illustrate, kind of use this point here, is that a lot of my work was on the sort of periphery of the city of Mosul in the north of Iraq, which is the largest urban center that fell under ISIS control. And much to my surprise, I found that some of the highest levels of ISIS recruitment were in the villages on the periphery of the city. And that was an extremely striking finding because a lot of those villages were by no means the poorest of the poor. They had amenities like air conditioners or like fridges that villages in much more peripheral, much more geographically isolated communities could only dream of. But what they did have was a proximity to this previously somewhat prosperous city before it got smashed up, and hence a strong awareness of the ever-growing gulf between their fortunes, which were almost entirely dependent on farming, which of course was crumbling as the rains failed and weakened on an increasing basis, and the fortunes of the urbanites, which were much, much less dependent on anything even vaguely related to climate stresses. And that kind of widening gulf in fortunes was once more putty in the hands of these unfortunately skilled recruiters. It was a series of resentments, a series of grievances that ultimately landed the place in a deeply unhappy state.
So, connected to all of that, one of the things in the book that I was really struck by was what you had to say about migration and how it's both an adaptation strategy, but it's also really hollowing out the villages. So could you talk a little bit about what's happening there?
Yeah. So migration is and always has been the natural coping mechanism that villagers in troubled places have turned to as a means of adapting to their diminished or kind of complicated circumstances. And what we are seeing as climate and environmental stresses intensify is that rural to urban migration is picking up with even greater velocity than it previously was. And that, unsurprisingly, comes with an array of security challenges. It comes with security challenges for the cities to which many of these migrants gravitate. Now, I will add a little kind of asterisk that the vast majority of migrants, whether they're fleeing climate or climate-related issues or anything else for that matter, kind of stay in or near their countries of origin. However, when they move in the kind of increasingly large numbers that they are to nearby cities, many of them end up competing with the kind of existing cohort of day laborers for construction site jobs and various other jobs that are perhaps within their kind of skill wheelhouse. They end up often competing for housing with the kind of existing urban poor. And got an image to also sort of illustrate the point I was keen to make here. This was a mine on the absolute periphery of the city of Ouagadougou, the capital of Burkina Faso. And it was about as hellish a sight as it looks here. It was probably 125 to 130 degrees in the bottom of this granite pit. It was smoky in the extreme because the workers, almost all of whom had been farmers from agricultural parts of Burkina Faso, who had migrated to the city as their incomes collapsed amid kind of an array of difficulties, were burning tires in order to soften up the granite and then using pickaxes and chisels and pretty much any other tool they could get their hands on to sort of lever it out of the ground. But these sites too were often seized upon by criminal gangs, by kind of local mafia organizations who realized that a lot of these sort of local, recently arrived migrants, many of whom had been torn from their family and kind of social safety support networks, and hence were that bit more vulnerable, much like the kind of would-be ISIS fighters, to the entreaties of these recruiters. So that's one part of the kind of migration national security crisis nexus. But the other comes within many of the villages, many of the communities that the migrants have left behind, because the people that migrate are almost always among the best and brightest. I mean, to migrate, no matter where you are in the world, is something that tends to require a strong degree of boldness. And it also requires money. And so the people who are leaving are those who are sort of the leading social lights, like the folks in the villages who are most responsible for maintaining their sense of self, most responsible for kind of resolving whatever kind of petty disputes inevitably crop up anywhere in the world. And in their absence, kind of small problems that were previously manageable often become anything but. The local councils, the local sort of dispute resolution mechanisms often collapse in the absence of this kind of village creme de la creme. And so it just becomes a kind of miserable cycle all round.
Sort of another angle on this that you touched on that I was really interested in was water as a weapon. We're not talking water balloons here, I assume. So how can water be a weapon?
Yeah. So what I look at in this book is I look at the ways in which climate and environmental stresses are contributing to conflict. I look at the ways in which conflict in turn contributes to more climate and environmental problems because, well, there are few things more polluting than war. But I also look, as Kate points out, at the ways in which water and various other natural resources can be weaponized, essentially used as tools of violence. And I mean, to go back to ISIS in Iraq and Syria for a moment, that conflict was a miserable kind of A to Z of the different ways in which water can be weaponized. On quite a few instances, especially in 2014 and 2015, when ISIS captured dams and various other important bits of water infrastructure, they either released large amounts of water as a means of slowing or preventing the advance of the anti-ISIS coalition, or alternatively, they held water back during the kind of pivotal periods when farmers needed that water in which to irrigate their crops. And that was a kind of means of punishing people who were not in areas under their control, And the idea, of course, was to sort of illustrate to them the sort of powerlessness of their own authorities. It was a means of kind of seeking to reduce the legitimacy of the Iraqi state by kind of signaling to those folks like how incapable their own government was of protecting them. And of course, none of this is new. I mean, we've had water used as a weapon kind of since time immemorial. I mean, famously in the Second World War, the Dutch flooded much of their own country as a means of trying to sort of slow the advance of the Nazi war machine over the course of their country. But certainly we are seeing the use of water as a weapon more now than at any point in recent history. And part of that is just because water is that bit more valuable as it becomes scarcer or less predictably available in many instances.
So that's clearly true in dry places like the Arab world, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But you also write about a number of places that I think of as being pretty well water endowed. So sort of take a hard left here, let's talk about Bangladesh. How on earth did you end up writing a chapter about pirates in a book called The Heat and the Fury?
Yeah, that is a very good question. We'll get to there. I've got a photo of a pirate or two somewhere. Here, well, not pirates per se. No, I've never quite outgrown my childish fascination with pirates, which becomes all the more inexplicable when you think about it, because they're basically just bandits in boats. But it was while working in a coastal part of southern Bangladesh back in 2015 or so that I sort of stumbled, totally by accident, on a form of climate-related violence that I didn't even know to ask about. And just a very quick sort of digression here for a moment. What I've tried to do in the book is show the many different levels at which climate-related violence strikes. Some of it happens at a headline-grabbing, sort of quote-unquote sexy level, as with sort of transnational terror groups like ISIS. But much of it is happening at a much more localized, much lower level, as in this community in coastal Bangladesh, in ways that have many fewer kind of global geopolitical ramifications, but are nevertheless no less punishing for those affected. But what I found was that as sea level rise and various other manifestations of climate and environmental stress bite, many farmers in the coastal belt of Bangladesh were losing their livelihoods. Their fields were increasingly inundated with salty water. Where is it? I lost the image. Will roll again once more. Their lands were getting eroded by kind of much more aggressive levels of river erosion, as indeed that particular image that I had up on the screen illustrated. And so many of those people had two choices. They could either migrate to Dhaka, the kind of megacity capital, or some of the country's other cities, and indeed, many of them were doing so. Up to 400,000 rural migrants arrive in Dhaka every single year, in addition to sort of large quantities of sort of organic population growth. But many people there, as in other parts of the world, don't want to move. They don't want to leave. And in these particular coastal communities, they had really one alternative livelihood, which was fishing. But the problem with fishing was that it took them deep into the sort of coastal waterways, many of which had been the long-time lair of these pirate groups, who derive kind of much of their living by kidnapping and holding for ransom whatever unfortunate souls happen to cross their path. But the problem here was that as the number of kind of farmers turned fishermen increased, so too did the number of pirates, because there was just that bit more available loot, that bit more available human lucre. And it just became this deeply unvirtuous cycle, which, an ever-growing number of these Bangladeshi villagers were having to contend with.
Do you think the pirates themselves are driven by climate change, or do you think it's more that the prey, these poor farmers that end up as fishermen or out in the sunderbans, in the mangroves, that it just becomes more and more appealing, and so it's attracting more pirates?
So, I interviewed a number of pirates who had accepted a government amnesty and in exchange for surrendering their weapons and confessing their crimes, They had been, kind of given a kind of reduced sentences. I asked these folks, many of whom had themselves been ex-farmers, whether their kind of diminished agricultural fortunes had contributed to their choice of criminality. And a few of them said yes, and it's possible that was true. I was a little bit skeptical of what was ultimately quite a self-serving narrative. Others, however, were totally upfront and straightforward and just admitted that they got greedy and they saw an easy way of kind of making a living. These guys were involved in almost every form of kind of ne'er-gooder kind of activity that one could imagine. They were implicated in tiger poaching, they were implicated in logging, stealing people out of their boats was just the sort of tip of the iceberg.
So I have to admit, I don't generally think about, fresh or brackish water pirates. I think because I tend to think of coastal areas as being well policed, but I have to assume that there aren't police here, and this speaks again to sort of the failure of the state to do its job and to keep its citizenry safe. Do you feel like that is kind of the same sort of thing that's happening in Iraq with ISIS?
Yeah, there's a lot of things going on. Certainly rank incompetence and mismanagement is at the heart of much of this. A lot of political scientists and other people in the kind of wider climate security space have tried to get to the bottom of why one place that's struggling with serious climate stresses collapses into climate-related violence, while another place that's suffering from similarly bad or possibly worse climate stresses prevents that kind of violence playing out. And the common denominator in almost every instance is that the place that avoids violence just experienced or displayed slightly greater degrees of statecraft. But what we see across much of the world, including in parts of the rich world, is that rural areas quite often get sort of abandoned to their fates, and services, including policing, are almost always stronger in urban or peri-urban areas. And for as long as kind of rural areas are significantly less economically important, as indeed they are in almost every part of the world, states will simply not dedicate the same kinds of resources to those areas as they do in richer ones.
So then let's talk about cities. I was really struck by your chapter about Nepal and Kathmandu. I think of Nepal as being a pretty wet place. The Himalayas as a water tower of Asia. How is Kathmandu running out of water?
Indeed. So this is Kathmandu. You're not the first person to be sort of somewhat taken aback or struck by the presence of Nepal in this book, an otherwise extremely safe, really wonderful country that absolutely all of you must visit. The single most dangerous thing that most of you are likely to encounter there is an overly spicy curry. But what Kathmandu does have is a very, very serious water crisis. And as you allude to, Kay, that is a very striking, highly surprising finding because, well, it sits in the shadow of the Himalayas, one of the world's biggest water towers. But what has happened is that as drought and various other climate and environmental stresses have hollowed out the livelihoods of many rural Nepalis, huge numbers of people have descended on Kathmandu, the capital. And in doing so, they have built over many of the aquifer recharge areas. They have built communities that extend well beyond the kind of areas that are serviced by pipelines. And they have created an opening for these highly rapacious, highly predatory private water tanker operators to step into the void. Here, sorry. And many of these guys charge significantly more for water than the state does. They provide water that is extremely dubious quality. And all of that, as far as many Nepalis are concerned, many residents of Kathmandu are concerned, is bad enough. But the very fact that it is happening in the shadow of the Himalayas, the very fact that it is happening in a city that was previously extremely used to high degrees of quality water provision, is sort of a very in-your-face illustration of state failure. And the reason why I included this chapter is because to me it's sort of illustrative of what is probably the single biggest global threat that climate and environmental stresses pose to security, which is the way in which they reduce the legitimacy or the perceived legitimacy of the state in many citizens' eyes. The more that climate and environmental stresses hollow out various services, the more that they undermine infrastructure, the more that they reduce states' capacity to provide affordable food or sufficient kind of fresh water or wastewater access, the wider the divergence between citizen expectations and the state's capacity to provide. And as we will perhaps talk about kind of later, this is something that the rich world is absolutely not immune to.
Well, so you provided the picture of the water tanker, and my sort of gut response to that was, well, that's great. I mean, that's the capitalism the way we want to think about capitalism being great. The government's failing, there's a hole in the market, and people are stepping up and filling it and providing for this really dire need. But it seems like that's both not what's happening and certainly not how it's perceived. So how did this go so wrong?
Yeah. Part of it, again, goes back to, well, a large part of it goes back to poor governance and mismanagement. I mean, ultimately, were these private water tank operators to be regulated, then the degree of suffering and the degree of kind of predatory activity would probably be a good deal lower. But it also goes to, I mean, what we are finding in rich parts of the world as well, is that when you have natural monopolies like utilities, this is an area where the free market often doesn't sort of really sort of hold itself in the kind of finest regard.
I was really struck by some of your stories talking to customers about how the poorer you were, the more you may get charged, and how sometimes the tankers would just not come to your neighborhood because you'd made too much of a fuss in the past.
Yeah. I mean, the climate security related part of the climate environmental discourse is similar to the kind of climate environment discourse in general, in that it's the sort of poor and defenseless who tend to get screwed the most. Now that's partly a reflection of the kinds of economic activities that they're involved with. I mean, I'm going to give you another sort of very human story. This was a guy called Omar, who was a river policeman on the Tigris in Iraq, just south of Mosul. And prior to ISIS's emergence, he had been a fisherman. And he plied his trade, along with much of his family, in the waters around here. But as the water levels ebbed on account of drought, and as the water quality worsened, in part because there was just obviously less river water to sort of dilute the horribleness of toxins that were kind of filtering into the river kind of almost every step of the way, his catch fell in that kind of commensurate manner. And so he had, by his reckoning, no choice but to sign on with the military when ISIS emerged. But in his case, I mean, he was an extremely quiet, highly sensitive character, someone who appeared quite ill-suited to sort of any kind of military service. As it was, both of his brothers had died in the fight to liberate Mosul from ISIS, and actually I and a photographer colleague spent an extremely bleak 3 days, along with a few other members of the river police, sailing back and forth along this part of the Tigris, looking for the bodies of both ISIS fighters and ISIS victims, many of which had washed up in the banks of the river. But I say that just to illustrate just the ways in which it's those who already have relatively little who are kind of most susceptible to the kinds of shocks and stresses that climate and environmental woes sort of unleash.
So I definitely took that point from the book, and overall, especially the Iraq and ISIS chapter, but this is a pretty depressing set of stories,
Yeah.
and dispiriting. and yet you end the Iraq chapter talking about hope and youth and environmental peace building. Can you tell us something hopeful?
Yeah, I guess. I find I think certainly by a certain stage in these talks, and just see some heads drooping and kind of just looks of depression settling upon people's faces. But there are a number of sources of sort of relative optimism to throw at you. One of which is this theme that you mentioned, environmental peace building. And to kind of simplify excessively, environmental peace building is basically the way in which you can harness shared environmental or climate problems to bring together tense or warring or hostile communities or peoples. And an example of this, I think I've got a photo to sort of illustrate this point, was back in the Sahel in West Africa. Oops, sorry. Yeah, here. So back in, I think, 2018, I spent about 2 weeks following this 300-strong herd of zebu cattle and their owners across a part of Mali and Burkina Faso. And this is an area that's been heavily roiled by fighting between farmer and herder groups, much of which has been very seriously intensified by drought. And yet in this very same part of the Sahel where that kind of conflict is becoming much more regular and much more intense, we stumbled, as we walked, on a few really interesting examples of where these kind of shared troubles had actually brought folks who previously wouldn't engage with one another back together. A local NGO with a very small amount of US support had introduced these things called pastoral units, which were kind of mediation mechanisms that brought together representatives of the farmers and representatives of the pastoralists and had them sit down with one another over kind of copious quantities of steaming, very sugary tea to hash out their differences. They would agree on compensation mechanisms if any of the cattle kind of trampled over and destroyed any of the crops. They would agree on compensation or on kind of maximum numbers of herds that could exist within certain areas, because many of the cattle were simply overgrazing many of these already quite fragile areas. And in this place where like almost every form of insecurity was playing out, in this area which is among the absolute poorest of the poor places in the entire world, there was relative peace because folks had kind of got their act together with this tiny bit of outside assistance to hash out their differences in a sort of peaceful manner. Equally, I mean, I'll kind of round out that point with another point of relative optimism, which is that if you go to this kind of place or places like it across parts of the Sahel, parts of the Middle East, parts of South Asia, it's extraordinary the kinds of difficulties and the kinds of poverty that these communities must contend with. And it's extraordinary the ways in which so many different climate and environmental stresses and even poor qualities of governance are kind of thrusting people against one another. But despite the sheer difficulty of their circumstances, people often go to the most incredible lengths to avoid violence. And it's sort of an illustration to me, and I've often been impressed that there's not a lot more in the way of hostilities in these places than there are. And I guess it's sort of a little bit of a kumbaya style point, but it's sort of given me a much greater faith in human nature and in kind of people's natural desire to not fight one another than I would necessarily have otherwise had.
Well, I'm glad to hear that, and I suspect the audience is glad to hear that too, because we did have a number of questions that folks submitted ahead of time that pretty much boiled down to, is there any hope? And kind of connected to that, you mentioned there was this NGO that did some really nice work. Do you think that sort of national policy frameworks, NGOs, development money, does that feel like it's making a difference with this? Do you feel hopeful about those, or do you think there need to be different kinds of routes towards addressing some of these issues?
So a lot of the issues I've been discussing here are quite difficult, if not near impossible, to manage at a hyper-international level. Why? Well, because, as I said, climate-related violence is sort of this ugly marriage climate stresses on the one hand and poor quality governance on the other. And both of those are extremely difficult phenomena to deal with. I mean, when I've written reports, as I quite frequently do, you always have to kind of cap them off with recommendations. And many of mine end up being some variation of take meaningful climate action, reduce corruption, and govern better. And I feel like I'm a total idiot writing things that are so trite as to be profoundly unhelpful. Equally, I mean, at a UN Security Council level, climate security as an issue has been at a bit of a dead-end street, in part because Russia has consistently, over the past decade and a bit, blocked any resolutions on this kind of issue. They see it as a breach of the UN Security Council's mechanism, along with kind of opposition from a number of other countries. That said, if we look at the local level, at the kind of Bangladeshi piracy level, at the farmer-herder conflict level, at which most of this kind of violence is playing out, this is where a lot of the kind of local initiatives that were previously sponsored by the likes of USAID have proven to be tremendously effective. And so we're at this kind of rather unfortunate inflection point in which a lot of the kind of violence that I've been describing is getting a lot more common and getting a lot more intense, at the same time as a lot of the money that the US and many European countries were previously giving is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking. And so, and another kind of, I guess, semi-positive takeaway that I would hope readers of the book get, which is that the kind of violence described throughout the book is a small taste of the kinds of violence that could be coming our way without meaningful action. Like, there's very little inevitability to all of this. Like, so much of it remains within our capacity to control or within our capacity to quash. And yes, so many of these sort of local USA and European government-funded initiatives were really quite pivotal in preventing a good deal of the violence that is now mushrooming in these places.
Well, so, you know, if we're talking about Europe and the United States, let's bring it home. How is this relevant to us here in Alabama, in the United States, in Europe? We've been talking about places that feel pretty far away for a while. Do we need to think about this here?
Yes. Yes, I mean, it's, when we talk about climate-related violence, as indeed we have thus far in this talk, there's a reason why it's mostly focused on poorer parts of the world. It is in poorer parts of the world where most of the most extreme manifestations of climate and environmental stress are playing out. It's in poor parts of the world in which a lot of the worst qualities of governance are on display. However, as our own climates become a good deal less hospitable in richer parts of the world, and as our own qualities of governance increasingly, to put it euphemistically, deteriorate somewhat, we too are starting to see variations of the phenomena that I've described here play out at home. To give you a number of US examples, I mean, whenever we have hurricanes, which are indeed striking with greater regularity and seemingly greater intensity in recent years, those are almost always accompanied by huge upticks in violence against women. I mean, when we saw in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene in 2024 and Hurricane Milton, occupancy rates of women's shelters reached absolute peak during those periods in local afflicted areas in ways they previously hadn't. Equally, we know that a vastly disproportionate number of the mass shootings that this country suffers happen between the months of June and September. Now, there's a number of reasons why summer is a period of peak precarity for reasons that are likely not connected to kind of extreme heat itself. Kids are not in school, there can be more financial precarity. However, we have a growing body of evidence showing that there are physiological differences or physiological changes in the brain during periods of extreme heat, which can make aggression that bit more likely. And I think in 2023, the stat is that about 88% of all of the mass shootings in this country occurred in the months of July, August, and early September, which is, of course, a vastly inordinate number. But also, I mean, to bring this back to the military component for a moment, there's a reason why the Pentagon and the UK Ministry of Defence and the Dutch Army and an array of other global militaries have been among those most engaged in this kind of research. and most willing to recognize the national security implications of a warming world from an early stage. And that's because so many of their operations and their critical infrastructure is increasingly being compromised by many of these forces. The very fact that the US naval base at Norfolk, Virginia, the largest installation of its kind in the world, is, or at least parts of which are underwater for greater periods of the year, is the sort of thing that is about as big a threat as possible for the US Navy. The very fact that National Guardsmen in this country are having to dedicate more time to fighting fires than they are in doing any kind of military training is, of course, a big, big problem as far as authorities in this country are concerned. The very fact, I think the stat there is that between 2019 and 2024, National Guardsmen in this country had to dedicate 3.5 times more kind of fighting wildfires than they had in the preceding decade. It's just an illustration of the fact that increasing numbers of them are unable to do their kind of core mission because they're forever being drawn away to combat this increasing volume of natural disasters. And then, a final point on that one, to go back to Nepal for a moment. We in the West, in Europe, in North America, in East Asia, kind of richer regions of the planet, tend to have much higher expectations of state. We've grown used to at least relatively good infrastructure. We've got used to relatively high expectations of kind of authorities' capacity to provide wastewater and fresh water and affordable food and various other things. And as those services and the state's capacity to provide them drops off that little bit more, we're starting to see quite dangerous degrees of anti-state sentiment that are probably quite closely correlated with sort of intensification of various climate stresses.
I'm not quite ready to riot yet, but I'm really not happy when the power goes out again and the AC doesn't run, especially in the summer.
Yeah, no, totally. I wrote a report late last year for the EU about climate-related criminality in Europe, and it's a brewing kind of time bomb of sorts. And a lot of these issues don't yet register on our collective radar because the forms of crime, the forms of instability that they're contributing to at home are thus far relatively low level. But these are the sorts of issues that I was reporting on in parts of Africa and parts of the Middle East a decade and a half ago, and increasingly we're seeing them within our own communities. So, if past is any prologue, we've got a whole bunch of complications coming our way.
Well, and excuse my putting on my tinfoil tiara and asking about conspiracy theories, but I understand that misinformation is all mixed up in a lot of this climate unrest. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Definitely. Misinformation and disinformation is something that obviously is unfortunately present in so many parts of our lives, and it's every bit as much of a fixture here. There we go. So this is an Egyptian soldier standing astride the Aswan High Dam, this massive megastructure in the south of Egypt. And when I think of kind of climate and environmental related instability and misinformation, disinformation, it's the Nile Dam dispute that most frequently comes to mind. Being based in Cairo for almost 6 years and working for quite some time on the Egypt-Ethiopia dispute, the thing that struck me most frequently as I interviewed quite a large number of senior Egyptian and Ethiopian policymakers over the years was the extent to which these senior officials believed this extraordinary amount of inaccurate information, this extraordinary amount of fake news. And so if we know anything about transboundary water conflict, I'll restart that point. If you speak to water experts, one of the things they will tell you is that transboundary water disputes do not lead to conflict. They're much more likely to lead to cooperation than confrontation. And historically, that has mostly been true. But one of the dangerous new ingredients that we're kind of adding into the mix is misinformation, disinformation. And for as long as officials are significantly less able to determine what is real from what is fake, the more likely they are to be making their judgments and making their policies off kind of far from accurate calculations. And what struck me through my many discussions with now Basin policymakers was their deeply imperfect understanding of the motivations and the rationale of their kind of political adversaries. And that's not a good place to be in.
So we're coming up on the end of the hour here, and a lot of the questions that we got ahead of this talk were really about what can we do, and especially what can students do as travelers, as they educate themselves. Where are there opportunities to make a difference in all of this?
Part of me, I mean, this is, as I said, a sort of issue that's sort of a little bit of a 36,000-foot one. So part of me is tempted to say, well, it's a question of just lobbying your policymakers, buying goods based on kind of sustainability and environment and climate savviness. But ultimately, the best thing that we as individuals can do is sort of try and affect change within our own communities. And if, as seems likely, various forms of climate and environment-related unrest are likely to kind of be felt that bit more locally than they previously have, well, things we can do is sort of, reinforce or climate-proof as best as possible our own communities. I mean, certainly in the aftermath of the shutdown of US aid and in the aftermath of kind of various other overseas development kind of cuts, many of my friends who were previously engaged in that kind of work have gravitated back to their home communities in various parts of the US, various parts of Europe, and they're looking to kind of affect the kind of change that they were implementing in parts of Africa, parts of the Middle East, parts of South Asia, within their own towns and cities, because the understanding is that ultimately this is the sort of challenge that we too must contend with.
Well, and I suspect some of the folks in the room have backgrounds in the sciences, in environmental science, but you don't, and you're making a pretty big impact here. So, as you think about other kinds of majors and expertise that people bring to the field, are there things that you think are particularly important that students bring with them?
Certainly, I mean, I think you said that there's probably a certain number of kind of journalism or sort of communications-focused students in here. The reason why I like to think that I hopefully been able to make something of a contribution in this space is because it's required the sort of very nitty-gritty sort of local reporting to sort of illustrate what's going on in ways that many of my peers and counterparts who haven't had the same kind of local access haven't necessarily been able to. So for those of you who are interested in this kind of work, or anything that's even tangentially related to it, so much of it hinges on just going out to the afflicted or hardest hit areas and just asking these questions, just seeing up close what's going on. I mean, one of the reasons why it seems that climate-related unrest has taken so long to receive the kind of attention it warrants is because you actually need to see how climate is interacting with everything else that's going on in an individual and a community's existence. And that is essentially journalistic work. And, I mean, it's not just a question of climate. I mean, as I hope all of you will have taken away, this is as much, if not more, a question of governance. And as we are seeing across this country, and as we've seen across almost every other part of the world, the worse that journalism's fortunes go, the less able we are to kind of maintain the kinds of democracies that we want. And it's, again, local journalism that is particularly important. I mean, even during periods when political polarization has been less of an issue than it currently is, people have always been more inclined to trust whatever their local newspaper is telling them rather than what some kind of national publication is. Also just directing your energies to reporting on whatever's playing out within kind of the greater Tuscaloosa area or further afield is also pivotal.
So we're coming up on the end of the hour, and I want to give you a chance to sort of say anything you feel like you haven't said, but I'm going to put it in the context of a question from the audience that I loved, which is, do you have any really crazy stories, or like a time you thought you were going to die while you were out reporting?
Yeah, I had a kind of, my 20s and early 30s were exchange period. I was never actively seeking out any kind of danger, but it sort of found me quite often. Yeah, I mean, certainly running from little sort of ISIS commercial drones was not my idea of fun. But no, I mean, the nature of trying to gather so much of this research was, by its very nature, intensely complicated. I had 2 kidnapping attempts, one in Iraq in 2014 and one in Syria in 2015, both of which were as horrifically terrifying as they sound. But those instances, as perilous and as grim and as kind of, horror-inducing as they were for me, also brought home to me, I think, the importance of covering this kind of issue. I mean, ultimately, in Basra in southern Iraq, which was the scene of one of my sort of kidnapping near misses, the folks who were trying to take me were members of a militia that had recruited heavily among recent arrivals in the city from rural areas. And as I later found out through various inquiries, those particular guys had come from a village where agriculture was basically the only economic game in town, and in which farming fortunes were basically unviable on account of lack of water. And that, of course, in no way, shape, or form justified what they were doing, but it helped to explain it.
Well, thank you so much for being here, Peter. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you. Despite the depressingness, I really enjoyed your book. And so, please, thank you. Let's give Peter a big hand. And if you want the book, you can buy them outside. He'll be signing.
Thank you very much for coming.